The sun was setting slowly through the faded curtains of the small house where Martha lived. At 70, her body carried the marks of a life of hard work and sacrifices. Sitting in her rocking chair on the porch, she watched the children playing in the street with a distant and melancholic gaze. Her grey hair, always tied in a simple bun, framed a face marked by deep wrinkles that told stories of smiles and tears. Her hands, calloused by time, absently caressed the framed portrait of a young man with eyes identical to hers, Michael, her only son, who years ago had chosen to leave without looking back. The silence of the house was her only faithful companion, interrupted only by the tick-tock of the old clock inherited from her mother. "Will you ever come back to me, my son? Or will I have to leave this world without seeing your face one last time?" she murmured to the portrait, as she did every afternoon at that same time. Martha's modest house reflected her personality, simple, organized, and full of small memories. On the walls worn by time, yellowed photos told the story of a family that was once happy, before ambition and greed drove away her only son, before the promises of wealth in distant lands seduced him more than maternal love. Every corner of that home kept memories of Michael, from his first steps on the worn wooden floor of the living room to the last look of contempt he cast at his mother before leaving. Martha kept everything exactly as he had left it, as if preserving the objects could somehow bring back the son she had known. His room remained untouched, a relic of a time that would not return, a sanctuary of hope she refused to abandon. "A mother never gives up on her children, even when they give up on her," she always said to the neighbor, who insisted she turn the room into something useful. "My heart knows that one day he will need me again." Night came, bringing with it a storm. The wind howled through the cracks of the poorly sealed windows like restless ghosts. Martha lit some candles to save on electricity that consumed a large part of her modest retirement. With slow and careful steps, she climbed the worn stairs toward her bedroom, carrying a cup of chamomile tea that helped relieve her arthritic pains. The handrail, loose in some places, swayed slightly under her weight. She knew she needed to fix it, but the few dollars she received barely covered the basic necessities. Her tired eyes did not notice the broken step at the top of the stairs, the one she always promised herself she would fix when she had some money to spare. In an instant, her fragile body lost balance. The teacup shattered on the floor as Martha fell down the staircase. A muffled scream escaped her lips before she lost consciousness. "Help!" was her last whisper before silence took over. For hours, Martha remained unconscious at the foot of the stairs, her body contorted at an impossible angle, her breathing faint and almost imperceptible. It was only the following morning that Karen, an old friend who came every day to bring fresh bread, found her. The horrified scream of the woman echoed through the empty house as she ran to the phone, her trembling fingers desperately dialing for help. The paramedics arrived in less than 20 minutes, their faces grave as they assessed the unconscious elderly woman. Her vital signs were weak, and it was evident that the head injury would require immediate medical attention. With precise and careful movements, they immobilized her neck and placed her on the stretcher, exchanging concerned looks that Karen immediately caught. As the ambulance departed with sirens wailing through the quiet morning, Karen searched through Martha's phone book, desperately seeking the only number she knew she should call, however painful it might be. "Michael, your mother has suffered a serious accident," she said when she finally made contact hours later. "The doctors don't know if she will survive this night." Thousands of miles away in a tiny, cluttered apartment, Michael awoke to the insistent ring of the telephone. His eyes, red from a poorly slept night after a party that lasted until dawn, took time to focus on the unknown number on the display. At 35, Michael was the shadow of the promising young man who had once left his mother's house in pursuit of grand dreams. His once handsome and expressive face was now marked by the excesses and disappointments of a life that hadn't gone as planned. His dark hair, disheveled and oily, framed eyes that had lost their sparkle of hope long ago. His body, once strong and athletic, now carried the signs of nights of drinking and irregular eating. The apartment in disarray, with empty bottles and unpaid bills scattered across every corner, was the silent witness to his misguided choices. "Who is it and what do you want at this hour?" he answered with a harsh voice, his irritation barely disguised as he tried to push away the headache hammering at his temples. The news about his mother's accident was received with a prolonged silence, followed by a heavy sigh of inconvenience. Michael hadn't returned home, even when he learned, through letters he rarely read, that his mother had fallen ill last winter. Now confronted with the real possibility of her death, he felt cornered by the responsibility he had tried to abandon. There were no other relatives, no siblings with whom he could share this burden. His mother's face, aged and full of love the last time he saw her, emerged in his mind like a silent accusation. With mechanical movements, he began gathering some clothes in a small suitcase, ignoring the chaos around him. It wasn't love or concern driving him, but an uncomfortable obligation mixed with guilt he had never managed to completely push away. "Damn it, Mum. Why did you have to do this now?" He muttered to the empty room while closing the suitcase with unnecessary force. "Just when I'm about to turn things around." The public hospital where Martha had been taken was an old building with peeling walls and corridors that were always crowded. Michael arrived after an exhausting journey, his mood worsening with every minute spent waiting at bus stations and connections. The characteristic smell of antiseptic and suffering hit his nostrils as soon as he crossed the automatic doors of the main entrance. At reception, a middle-aged nurse with deep circles under her eyes barely looked up from the forms she was filling out when he asked for Martha's room. Following the directions, Michael went up to the intensive care unit floor, where his step faltered for the first time. The reality of the situation began to weigh on his shoulders. His mother could be dying, and his last contact had been a brief letter sent last Christmas with empty promises of a visit that never happened. "I'm here to see Martha," he said to the nurse at the central station, avoiding using the word mother as if that could diminish his responsibility. "I'm the only relative." The doctor responsible for Martha's case was a middle-aged man with kind eyes that contrasted with the seriousness of the diagnosis he shared with Michael. In a small private room near the intensive care unit, he explained in simple terms the severity of the situation. Martha had suffered severe head trauma in the fall, along with 3 broken ribs and a hip fracture, that would require surgery once her condition stabilized. Most concerning, however, was the internal bleeding that doctors had been trying to control since her arrival. The next 24 hours would be crucial in determining whether she would survive. The doctor spoke with professional compassion that Michael couldn't reciprocate, his face remaining impassive as he processed the information. It wasn't the physical injuries that surprised him, but discovering that his mother, always so strong and resilient in his memories, could be defeated by a simple broken step. "Is there a possibility of permanent sequelae if she survives?" Michael asked, his mind already calculating the potential costs and inconveniences of caring for an invalid elderly woman. "I want to be prepared for all scenarios." Finally authorized to see his mother, Michael entered the intensive care unit room with hesitant steps. The sight that greeted him bore no resemblance to the memories he kept of Martha. Connected to various machines monitoring her vital signs, his mother seemed to have shrunk and aged decades since the last time he saw her. Her face, partially covered by an oxygen tube, was pale and bruised, with purplish spots dramatically contrasting with the wrinkled skin. Her grey hair, always so carefully arranged in his memories, was irregularly cut in some places, where doctors had treated scalp wounds. Her hands, which he remembered always in motion, cooking, sewing, caressing his face as a child, now lay motionless on the white hospital sheet, with needles and sensors binding them to reality. Michael remained standing at the door for several minutes, unable to approach, feeling like an intruder in his mother's silent struggle for survival. "I don't know what to say to you after so long," he finally whispered, keeping himself at a safe distance from the bed. "Never was good with goodbyes, were you?" The hours dragged on as Michael alternated between waiting in the hallway and making brief visits to his mother's room. Doctors and nurses constantly entered and left, adjusting equipment and administering medications. Some cast curious glances in his direction, probably noticing the apparent lack of emotion given the severity of the situation. Michael ignored everyone, responding only the minimum necessary when directly addressed. In his mind, he was already planning what he would do after the outcome of that situation, whatever it might be. If his mother survived, he would place her in some institution for the elderly, where he could visit her occasionally without compromising his freedom. If she passed away, well, he would sell the house and the few valuable belongings to pay his own debts. The coldness of his thoughts didn't bother him. Years living on the margins of society had hardened something inside him that had once been capable of loving unconditionally. "Sir, you need to sign these responsibility forms," a nurse interrupted his thoughts, extending a clipboard with various documents, "and also decide about resuscitation procedures if necessary." The night advanced slowly, transforming the hospital into a labyrinth of diffuse lights and muffled sounds. Michael had found an uncomfortable sofa in the waiting room where he tried, unsuccessfully, to find a position to rest. The fatigue from the journey and the tension of the situation were beginning to weigh on him, but sleep refused to come. Instead, long-suppressed memories began to emerge. His mother singing to chase away his childhood nightmares, teaching him to read with infinite patience, working 2 jobs so he could have the same toys as other children. He recalled their last argument, the cruel words he had hurled at her when she tried to prevent him from leaving, the look of disappointment and sadness that had haunted him in his loneliest moments. Michael closed his eyes tightly, as if he could physically block the flow of unwanted memories, but they continued to come, flooding his consciousness with the weight of choices that could not be undone. "You made your choice a long time ago," he said to himself quietly, trying to reaffirm the emotional distance he had so carefully constructed. "This is no time for useless sentimentality." Suddenly, a shrill alarm cut through the relative silence of the intensive care unit. Michael rose with a start, observing the sudden movement of doctors and nurses running toward his mother's room. His body reacted automatically, following them until he stood at the door, witnessing the chaotic scene unfolding. Martha's cardiac machine triggered incessant alarms, her previously stable line now showing erratic patterns that even Michael, without medical knowledge, could perceive meant danger. The doctor shouted precise orders, while the team worked frenetically around the fragile body fighting against death. Devices were brought quickly, medications administered in rapid sequence, but the alarms continued to sound mercilessly, announcing that life was escaping with each second. "We're losing her," shouted the doctor, initiating resuscitation maneuvers with firm and precise movements. "Prepare the defibrillator immediately." Michael remained motionless at the door, observing everything with an impassive expression that masked the whirlwind of contradictory emotions assailing him. There were no tears in his eyes, no desperate pleas leaving his lips. He just observed, like a distant spectator of a particularly intense play. A nurse gently tried to move him away from the door, explaining that he should wait outside, but he silently resisted, planted in place like a statue. In that moment, suspended between life and death, Michael confronted the real possibility of forever losing the only person who had truly, unconditionally loved him. And the strange feeling of emptiness this provoked in his chest was not exactly sadness, nor relief. It was something more complex that he couldn't name, something that connected him to the boy he once was, before bitterness and greed poisoned his heart. "Come on, Mother," he finally murmured, so low that no one could hear him amid the chaos of voices and alarms. "You were always stronger than I thought." Against all medical expectations, Martha survived the critical night. Her heart, fragile but stubborn, refused to give up even when all the equipment sounded alarms of despair. Michael, who had watched the doctors struggle with eyes empty of emotion, was surprised by the doctor the next morning with the news that his mother had stabilized. Recovery would be long and painful, the professional explained, detailing the multiple fractures and cranial trauma that would require special care for weeks, perhaps months. The hip surgery had been successfully performed during the early morning hours, taking advantage of the brief stabilization of her vital signs. Martha had not yet regained consciousness, but the tests indicated normal brain activity, a promising sign that she might wake up without significant neurological sequelae. With a poorly disguised sigh of inconvenience, Michael listened to the instructions about medications, dressings, and special care that would be necessary after hospital discharge. "How long will I have to stay here taking care of her?" he asked bluntly, ignoring the doctor's disapproving look. "I have important matters to resolve and cannot be absent indefinitely." 2 weeks passed with Martha slowly recovering in the hospital. Michael established a mechanical routine, visiting her briefly in the morning and evening, spending the rest of the day wandering around the city or locked in some cafe with free Wi-Fi, sending desperate emails to creditors and making payment promises he knew he couldn't keep. When his mother finally awoke, her tired eyes lit up with genuine joy at seeing her son by her side, a reaction that made him look away, uncomfortable with the unconditional love he didn't deserve. Her first words were to ask if he was okay, if he was eating properly, maternal concerns that completely ignored her own critical condition. Martha didn't mention the abandonment of recent years, nor did she demand explanations for unkept promises. Her gratitude for her son's presence seemed to erase all the past neglect, a capacity for forgiveness that Michael couldn't understand and that somehow intensified his own resentment. "I'm fine, Mother, stop worrying about me," he responded dryly, adjusting the pillow under her head with abrupt movements. "You almost died. You should think about yourself at least now." The day of hospital discharge arrived with a mixture of relief and apprehension for Michael. The doctors reinforced the need for continuous care, physiotherapy sessions, and frequent follow-up visits. Martha, still fragile but determined, insisted she could manage on her own so as not to disrupt her son's life, a suggestion he pretended to refuse out of obligation, while secretly planning to leave at the first opportunity. With Michael's reluctant help, Martha was settled into the taxi that would take them home, her thin body now more fragile after weeks of hospitalization. During the journey, she spoke animatedly about small pleasures she longed to resume, preparing her own tea, sitting on the porch to watch the sunset, sleeping in her own bed. Michael responded with monosyllables, his mind occupied calculating how long it would be socially acceptable to stay before inventing some emergency that would justify his departure. The taxi traversed familiar streets that awakened unwanted memories in Michael, each corner a landmark of a childhood he preferred to forget, each square a reminder of broken promises and abandoned dreams. "Soon you'll be back to your life, son," Martha said softly, incorrectly interpreting his silence as concern for her. "I know you can't stay long, but these few days together are already a gift I didn't expect to receive." The taxi finally stopped in front of Martha's house, and Michael had to blink several times to make sure they were at the correct address. The modest adobe construction he kept in his memories had transformed. The facade, previously peeling and neglected, now displayed a fresh paint job in elegant earthy tones. The small front garden, which he remembered as a jumble of weeds and dried-out shrubs, had been meticulously landscaped with colorful flowers and a path of polished stones leading to the front door. The old windows had been replaced with new models with decorative frames, and the entrance door, previously faded and cracked, was now an imposing piece of dark wood with wrought iron details. Michael remained paralyzed on the sidewalk, unable to reconcile the image before him with the humble house he had abandoned years ago. Martha, noticing his surprise, smiled discreetly as he helped her out of the vehicle, leaning heavily on his arm due to the fragility of her legs still in recovery. "The house needed some repairs," she commented casually, as if the complete transformation could be summarized as minor fixes. "After I retired, I finally had time to take care of our home as I always wanted." The interior of the house proved even more surprising. The old worn furniture that Michael remembered had been replaced with elegant solid wood pieces. The simple concrete floor had given way to polished ceramics that reflected the natural light coming through the enlarged windows. The walls, once covered only by a few family photos in cheap frames, now displayed original paintings and delicate tapestries. The kitchen, which Michael remembered as a cramped space with outdated appliances, had been completely modernized with granite countertops, custom cabinets, and stainless steel equipment that seemed never to have been used. While helping his mother settle into the recliner in the living room, another piece that certainly wasn't there during his last visit, Michael tried to process the inexplicable transformation. Martha had always lived with limited resources, saving every penny of her salary as a cleaner to provide the essentials for both of them. The luxurious house he found himself in now didn't match the simple woman who refused to buy new clothes for herself, while she could still mend the old ones. "How did you manage to pay for all this, Mom?" he finally asked, unable to contain his curiosity that was already mixing with calculating interest. "I thought you were living just on your pension." With Martha finally asleep in her room after the tiring return home, Michael began to systematically explore each room, seeking answers to his mother's sudden prosperity. He carefully opened drawers, checked inside books, examined the bottom of vases and decorative boxes, his mind focused exclusively on the possibility of discovering hidden money or valuable objects. In the newly decorated guest room, he found an old dresser that he recognized as the only original piece preserved from the house, a family furniture passed through generations that his mother had always refused to sell even in the most difficult times. He checked each drawer without success until he noticed that the bottom of the last one seemed higher than the others. With skilled fingers, after years of living off small scams and tricks, he identified a secret compartment and opened it easily. Inside, he found a plastic folder containing meticulously organized documents with Martha's characteristic attention to detail. "What do we have here?" he muttered to himself, sitting on the bed while examining the contents with growing incredulity. Looks like the old lady had secrets after all. The documents revealed a story Michael could never have imagined. 2 years after his departure, Martha had suffered an accident while working as a cleaner in a wealthy family's mansion. A fall from a ladder while cleaning chandeliers resulted in serious injuries that left her temporarily disabled. The negligence lawsuit against the employers, who had not provided adequate safety equipment, resulted in a substantial settlement, a small fortune for someone with Martha's modest habits. Bank statements showed intelligent investments of this money over the years, with consistent returns that had practically doubled the original value. Michael quickly did the math in his head. The current amount equaled approximately 10 years of his salary in the best jobs he'd ever had, before losing everything in bets and failed schemes. A calculating smile slowly formed on his face as he imagined how this money could solve his current problems and provide the lifestyle he always believed he deserved. His thoughts were interrupted when he found at the bottom of the folder a more recent document, an official will dated just 3 months ago. "I can't believe what I'm reading," he whispered, his face paling as he went through the clauses of the document. "After everything I did for her as a child, is this how she repays my sacrifice?" The will was clear and unequivocal. Martha had designated her entire fortune to be divided among 3 charities for the elderly and underprivileged children. There was no mention of Michael's name anywhere in the document, no provision for the only son she always claimed to love unconditionally. The justification, written by Martha herself in an attached letter, explained that she considered having fulfilled her maternal obligations during her son's upbringing, providing him with education and opportunities that he had chosen to waste. The money, she argued, would be better spent helping those who truly needed a chance in life. Michael felt the blood pulsing in his temples, anger growing like a suffocating wave. How dare his own mother judge him like this? How could she ignore his difficulties, his failures, the circumstances that led him to make questionable decisions? For a few moments, he imagined confronting her immediately, demanding explanations, and forcing her to reconsider this injustice. But then he took a deep breath, forcing himself to think rationally. Martha was still fragile, dependent on him for basic care. There was time to manipulate the situation in his favor. "Let's see who laughs last, dear mother," he murmured while carefully replacing the documents in the hiding place, making sure everything appeared untouched. "You've always underestimated me. That was your biggest mistake." The following days transformed Michael into the devoted son Martha had always dreamed of having back. He prepared her meals following medical guidelines strictly, administered medications at exact times, accompanied her to physiotherapy sessions with infinite patience and attention to detail. Each smile, each gentle gesture was meticulously calculated to fully restore his mother's trust, to convince her of his sincere remorse for his years of absence. At night, when Martha fell asleep exhausted from her recovery routine, Michael occupied himself researching on his phone information about insurers, health documents, and legal loopholes in wills. He discovered that, as an only child, he could contest the will, claiming that his mother wasn't of sound mind when she wrote it, but the process would be long and uncertain. A more efficient idea began to form in his mind, a substantial life insurance policy with him as the sole beneficiary. With Martha's advanced age and recent medical history, The premiums would be high, but the potential return would more than compensate for the initial investment. The challenge would be getting her signature on documents she certainly wouldn't approve if she understood their real content. "I just need to buy time and gain her absolute trust," he planned, while watching Martha sleep peacefully, oblivious to the machinations of the son she loved so much. And then, a small accident will permanently solve everything. 1 week after returning from the hospital, Michael had already established contact with a lawyer of questionable reputation, recommended by former associates from his illegal gambling days. The man, specializing in forged documents and fraudulent insurance schemes, assured that he could provide everything Michael needed for a reasonable percentage of the insurance value when received. Negotiations occurred exclusively by phone, always when Martha was sleeping or during her physiotherapy sessions. Michael carefully collected samples of his mother's signature from old letters and household documents, sending them via messaging app so they could be perfectly reproduced on the new documents. The plan was taking shape quickly. A life insurance policy for the maximum value that could pass without detailed investigations, using Martha's current health condition as justification for his sudden concern with future financial planning. Michael calculated he would need to maintain the devoted son charade for just a few more weeks, enough time for the documents to be processed and the policy to take effect. After that, well, domestic accidents were sadly common among recovering elderly people, especially those with reduced mobility and a recent history of falls. "It will be such a tragic loss," he murmured to himself, while practicing expressions of grief in the bathroom mirror. The poor lady had barely recovered from her first accident when cruel fate took her away for good. On a particularly hot afternoon, while Martha rested in her room after lunch, Michael received the call he had been waiting for. The documents were ready, including a falsified medical certificate confirming that Martha enjoyed good mental health and sufficient physical condition to take out insurance without raising suspicions. The lawyer explained that he had opted for a smaller insurance company, known for less rigorous investigations, ensuring that everything would be finalized within a few days after receiving the signed documents. Michael hung up the phone with a satisfied smile, already visualizing the money that would soon be his. He moved silently through the house to the makeshift office he had set up in the guest room, where he kept his laptop and materials related to the plan. He dialed the lawyer's number again to confirm the final details before the documents arrived. "I need fake documents and an urgent life insurance policy," he spoke in a low voice, nervously checking the hallway to make sure Martha was still sleeping. "The faster we resolve this, the better for all of us." A subtle noise behind him made Michael freeze mid-sentence, the words dying on his lips like a flame, suddenly deprived of oxygen. The phone trembled slightly in his hand as his muscles instinctively tensed. The old wooden floor of the house had always been a betrayer of furtive movements, each board with its own distinctive voice, a code that his mother knew better than anyone after decades inhabiting those walls. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, an icy current running down his spine. "Wait a moment," he whispered to the lawyer on the line, muffling the microphone with his sweat-damp palm. The hands of the desk clock seemed to have frozen in time, the ticking amplified by the oppressive silence that followed. He turned slowly, his heart racing with the possibility of having been discovered, each beat resonating in his ears like a primitive drum announcing imminent danger. The late afternoon light penetrated obliquely through the window, casting elongated shadows that distorted reality, transforming innocent objects into silent observers of his conspiracy. For an instant, he glimpsed what appeared to be a shadow disappearing down the hallway, a fleeting, almost feminine form, moving with the silent grace he had always associated with his mother, even in her advanced age. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice oscillating slightly between authoritative and fearful. The echo of his own words returned without response. With 3 wide strides he reached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. His fingers gripped the doorknob with unnecessary force, his knuckles whitening from the effort. The corridor stretched empty before him, bathed in the twilight's dimness. The family photographs on the walls observing him with accusing eyes from happier times. "Mother?" he called again, striving to inject normality into his voice. "Do you need something?" But when he checked, He found only the empty, silent space inhabited only by the lingering aroma of lavender perfume his mother had always worn. Her door ajar at the end of the hallway let through a sliver of light from her room, but no movement was perceptible. Downstairs, the refrigerator turned on with a distant hum, making him start like a criminal caught in the act. "Where were we?" he muttered as he returned to the phone, running his hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Yes, I need the documents without fail by tomorrow." He returned to the phone with cautious steps, his feet instinctively avoiding the points in the floor he knew would produce telling creaks. The lawyer was saying something about risks and percentages, but Michael barely processed the words, his mind still divided between the conversation and the disturbing sensation of being watched. "I don't care about the risks," he abruptly cut in. "Double your commission if necessary, but I want everything ready as agreed." He ended the conversation with final instructions, his voice acquiring that authoritative tone he used to mask nervousness, and quickly hung up. The silence that followed seemed almost tangible, a living presence breathing alongside him in that confined space. Through the window, he observed a dark cloud slowly moving across the sky, promising a storm for later. "I'm getting paranoid," he thought, massaging his temples where a headache was beginning to form like a harbinger of problems. It's just the tension of the last few days. Perhaps it was just his hyperactive imagination, fueled by the guilt he refused to consciously acknowledge, that uncomfortable whisper in the back of his mind that persistently tried to remind him that he was planning to kill his own mother. He reached into his pocket for the bottle of anxiety pills, swallowing two dry with a grimace. "It's necessary," he justified mentally, repeating the mantra he had adopted since conceiving the plan. "I have no choice." Or perhaps the wind had simply moved some door or curtain, creating that fleeting illusion of movement. The old windows of the house had always allowed currents of air that made the curtains dance like translucent ghosts, a phenomenon that frightened him in childhood, and which his mother had patiently explained was nothing supernatural. "Your imagination has always been your strength and your torment, my son," he could hear her voice saying, a memory he ruthlessly pushed away. In any case, he couldn't afford paranoia now, not when he was so close to achieving his goal, with the suffocating debts about to be eliminated with a single decisive blow. He carefully stored all evidence of his plan in the false drawer he had created under the desk, locking it with the small key he kept hidden inside the lining of his wristwatch. He stood up, adjusting the crease in his pants with precise gestures, and prepared to return to the role of the devoted son. He paused briefly before the small mirror on the wall, studying his own reflection with critical eyes. He methodically adjusted his expression like an actor before entering the stage, relaxed his furrowed brow, softened the hard lines around his mouth, forced a slight raising of the corners of his lips, and finally modeled his gaze to reflect a genuine concern he did not feel. "Perfect," he murmured, satisfied with the transformation. "She will never suspect." The path to fortune was clearly laid out before him, each step meticulously planned like moves in a chess game. He just needed to follow the plan, and soon all his financial problems would be merely distant memories, just as Martha would soon be. A strange tightness in his chest arose with this last thought, but he ruthlessly suppressed it, as he had done with every flash of moral conscience in recent weeks. "It was just the wind," he muttered to himself as he carefully closed the office door, the click of the lock sounding like the final sentence from an invisible judge. His fingers briefly caressed the polished wood, as if sealing a pact. "Nothing will prevent me from recovering what is rightfully mine." 3 weeks had passed since Martha's return from the hospital, and the change in Michael's behavior became more disconcerting each day. The son, who previously could barely disguise his contempt and impatience, now showed attentiveness, down to the smallest details. He prepared medicinal teas she had never mentioned enjoying, insisted on helping her bathe even when she assured him she could manage alone, and spent hours reading to her with a patience he had never demonstrated even in childhood. The breakfast table always appeared carefully arranged when Martha woke up, with fresh fruits cut into decorative shapes and breads he fetched from the most distant bakery in town, known for its artisanal products. During physiotherapy sessions, Michael took detailed notes of the exercises and insisted on repeating them at home, monitoring Martha's every movement with an intensity that alternated between careful and suffocating. At night, he repeatedly made sure she had taken all her medications, checking the bottles as if his life depended on the accuracy of that count. Behind her grateful smile, Martha began to feel growing discomfort, an inexplicable feeling that something was deeply wrong with this sudden transformation. "Michael, my son, you don't need to try so hard. I'm much better now, I can take care of myself," she commented one morning, watching him meticulously arrange the pillows behind her back. "I've never seen you so dedicated, not even when you cared for your pets in childhood." The long conversations at dusk, which initially seemed like genuine attempts at reconnection, began to follow a pattern that aroused Martha's suspicions. Michael asked insistent questions about her finances, disguised as concern for her future well-being. He wanted to know about investments, health insurance plans, and especially about the will he had found, though he never admitted to having seen the document. "It's important to have everything organized, Mother, especially after a scare like this," he would say with false casualness, while his eyes quickly scanned the valuable items in the room. Martha, with the wisdom of 7 decades of life, recognized the subtle signs of greed, the same calculating gleam she had seen in her husband's eyes before he left with the couple's savings, the same artificially disinterested tone Michael used in adolescence when he wanted money for expenses he never explained. During her short walks in the garden, a fundamental part of her physiotherapy, she noticed how her son constantly checked his cell phone, moving away to take calls in a low voice, returning with smiles that didn't reach his eyes. At night, when everyone should be sleeping, the creaking of the hallway boards betrayed his furtive movements around the house. "Something has changed in him, Nancy, but it's not what I've always hoped for," she murmured during a visit from her longtime friend, making sure Michael was busy in the garden. "His eyes are different. There's a hidden purpose that gives me chills." Nancy, with her 65 years and intuition sharpened by decades working as a nurse, had become more than a friend to Martha. She was her confidant, her connection to the world beyond those walls, since reduced mobility had limited her outings. She visited daily with the excuse of bringing fresh bread and checking on her friend's recovery. But her real visits began when Michael left to resolve pending matters in town. In these moments, the two women spoke freely, with Martha expressing her growing concerns about her son's enigmatic behavior. Nancy, who had never hidden her disapproval of Michael's abandonment, listened attentively, her wrinkled face furrowing with increasing concern at each new detail shared. When Martha reported her son's insistence on personally administering her medications, even those she had taken for years without assistance, Nancy decided they needed to investigate further. "Your son has never been a saint, Martha, and leopards don't change their spots overnight," Nancy declared firmly, squeezing her friend's hand. "We need to find out what he's really plotting before it's too late." The first stage of the investigation fell to Nancy. Using the excuse of needing help carrying heavy groceries, she convinced her nephew, a young man who worked at the town's only bank, to discreetly check Michael's financial situation. The information came back more alarming than either of them could have imagined. Michael was drowning in debts that had accumulated for years, unpaid loans, credit cards cancelled due to default, and most worryingly, records of threats from loan sharks known for violent collection methods. His last known address was a boarding house room on the outskirts of a large city, abandoned months ago, leaving overdue rent. There was no record of formal employment in the last 5 years, only brief temporary jobs often ending with accusations of misappropriation or financial irregularities. The man who now lovingly cared for Martha was, in fact, a fugitive pursued by relentless creditors, someone whose survival depended on increasingly desperate schemes. When Nancy reported her findings, Martha cried silently, not so much for the money that certainly motivated her son's sudden interest, but for realizing that the miraculous transformation she so wanted to believe in was just another lie. "So this is what life has done to my son, turned him into a man who sees even his own mother as a profit opportunity," Martha lamented, wiping away tears with trembling hands. "And the worst part is that, even knowing this, part of me is still happy to have him here, to pretend we're a family again." Martha's concern intensified when she noticed other changes in Michael's behavior. He began insisting on personally preparing all her meals, refusing even Nancy's help, who frequently brought homemade dishes. "I need to ensure your diet strictly follows medical recommendations," he justified with a smile that never reached his watchful eyes. The portions always came meticulously arranged, with medications separated beside the plate, and Michael observed with disturbing attention each forkful she brought to her mouth. When Martha occasionally expressed lack of appetite or nausea after meals, he demonstrated a paradoxical combination of exaggerated concern and poorly disguised satisfaction. Another disturbing behavior was his insistence on personally administering pain medications, always double-checking the dosage with an intense concentration that seemed disproportionate to the simple task. Martha began pretending to swallow the pills, hiding them under her tongue to discard later, a precaution that initially seemed like paranoia, but each day proved more justified. "Feeling dizzy after taking your medicine, Mother?" "It's a common side effect. The doctor mentioned it might happen," Michael would comment with false concern when she purposely simulated feeling unwell. "Perhaps we should increase the dose so you can rest better." The opportunity for a deeper investigation arose when Michael announced he would need to spend the entire afternoon in town, resolving issues related to Martha's health insurance. "I'll be back before nightfall, Mother. Take your medications on schedule. I've left everything on your bedside table," he instructed before leaving, discreetly locking his bedroom door, a detail that didn't escape Martha's attentive observation. As soon as the sound of the car disappeared in the distance, she called Nancy, who was waiting for the signal at her own house just a few meters away. With determined steps despite the persistent pain in her recovering hip, Martha led her friend to Michael's room. The locked door presented only a momentary obstacle for Nancy, who produced from her purse a set of thin hairpins with the surprising skill of someone who had done this many times before. "I learned from my late husband. God rest his soul. He was always forgetting his keys inside the house," she explained, with a mischievous smile that brought a brief moment of lightness to the tense situation. "I never thought I'd need to break into my own son's room in my house," Martha whispered, as she watched Nancy skillfully manipulate the hairpins in the lock. What kind of mother reduces herself to spying on her son as if he were a criminal? Michael's impeccably tidy room proved to be a facade as false as his newly discovered filial devotion. Under the carefully stretched mattress, they found envelopes containing threatening letters from various creditors, some dated just a week ago, proving that his debts remained active and growing. In the bedside table drawer, hidden beneath folded socks, a notebook contained detailed notes about Martha's medication schedules with disturbing observations such as more intense effect when combined with fatty foods and gradual increase in dosage, test tolerance limits. The most disturbing discovery, however, was at the bottom of the partially unpacked suitcase in the closet. Carefully wrapped in a shirt, they found an unlabeled bottle containing a crystalline white powder that resembled no medication prescribed for Martha. Next to the bottle, a set of documents revealed Michael's complete plan. Life insurance forms with Martha's forged signatures, naming him as the sole beneficiary of a policy of substantial value, recently activated. "My God, Nancy, he intends to kill me," Martha murmured, her hands trembling so much she almost dropped the documents. "My own son is slowly poisoning me to receive insurance I never even authorized." The realization of the complete truth hit Martha like a physical blow, leaving her momentarily breathless. The slight nausea after meals, his insistence on personally preparing her food, the obsessive monitoring of medications, all the puzzle pieces fit together in a macabre picture of calculated betrayal. The tears silently streaming down her wrinkled cheeks were not just of fear, but of a deep grief for the son she had truly lost, not when he had left years ago, but when he returned transformed into someone capable of coldly planning his own mother's death for money. Nancy, perceiving the devastating impact of the discovery, embraced her friend tightly, offering the silent support that no words could provide in that moment. With the wisdom of someone who had witnessed the worst of human nature during decades working in hospitals, she did not suggest calling the police immediately. "We need concrete evidence, Martha, and we need to protect you while we gather it," she explained in a low but firm voice. "If we confront him now, he may accelerate his plans or simply disappear to try again when we lower our guard." How could I have raised a monster without realizing it, Nancy? Martha questioned, her body still trembling with the impact of the discovery. What terrible failure as a mother would make me unable to see the darkness growing inside my own son? With Nancy's help, Martha carefully photographed all the documents and the suspicious bottle before replacing them exactly as they had found them. They left the room leaving everything in perfect order, closing the locked door with the same skill with which they had opened it. The initial plan was simple. Martha would continue pretending to be unaware of her son's intentions, but would take precautions not to ingest anything prepared by him. Nancy would bring food disguised as treats, and Martha would pretend to eat Michael's meals only when he was watching, discreetly discarding them when possible. Meanwhile, the mysterious bottle would be analyzed by Nancy's pharmacist friend, someone trustworthy who wouldn't ask unnecessary questions. Martha insisted she didn't want to involve the authorities immediately. Part of her still hoped there might be some alternative explanation, some less horrible interpretation of the evidence discovered. Maybe he's being threatened by someone. Maybe he sees no other way out of his debts, she tried to rationalize, her maternal heart desperately seeking any justification that wouldn't completely condemn the son she still loved despite everything. I know it's difficult to accept, Martha, but we need to face the facts as they are, not as we'd like them to be, Nancy responded with the firm gentleness that characterized her. A man capable of poisoning his own mother has already crossed boundaries that no circumstance can justify. The following days transformed into an elaborate theater where Martha played the role of a naive and trusting mother while observing each of Michael's movements with new eyes, alert and suspicious. She noticed details that previously escaped her perception. How he discreetly checked if she had consumed all her food, the subtle satisfaction in his look when she simulated dizziness after meals, the poorly disguised irritation when Nancy appeared unexpectedly during feeding times. Michael became increasingly controlling, limiting her visits and monitoring her phone calls with excuses of protecting her from excessive fatigue. Martha noticed how he gradually isolated her from the outside world, creating an environment where it would be easier to execute his plans without interference. To maintain her charade, she frequently praised her son's care, expressed gratitude for his dedication, and even commented on how she felt weaker and more dependent each day, feeding his false perception that the plan was working. "I don't know what I would do without you, my son," she would say with a smile that masked her broken heart, observing how he swelled with pride at the compliment. "Each day, I'm more thankful to have you by my side during this difficult time." On Wednesday morning, Nancy arrived with alarming news. Her pharmacist friend had identified the substance in the vial as a toxic compound that in small and constant doses produced symptoms easily confused with natural complications of Martha's age and recovery: dizziness, nausea, mental confusion, progressive weakness. If it continued to be administered, it would eventually cause kidney or cardiac failure that would appear to be a natural result of the stress from the previous accident, hardly raising suspicions in an elderly patient in recovery. The confirmation of Michael's homicidal plan eliminated any remaining doubt. He was systematically poisoning his own mother, planning a death that would look natural to claim the insurance money. Martha felt the world spin around her with this confirmation, needing to sit down to regain her balance. For a few moments, she considered confronting him immediately, driven by the anger and disappointment burning in her chest. But the wisdom acquired over decades of life prevailed over the emotional impulse. "We need to be smarter than him, Nancy," she finally decided, her voice finding a firmness that surprised even her friend. "If he wants to play this deadly game, he'll discover that his old mother still has a few tricks up her sleeve." "What do you intend to do, Martha?" asked Nancy, concern evident in her trembling voice that barely overcame the monotonous tick-tock of the wall clock. Seated in the floral-patterned armchair, faded by time, her knotty hands squeezed the embroidered handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles whitened like small limestone pebbles. The tea they had prepared cooled untouched in the porcelain cups on the small center table, forming a thin film on the surface. "This isn't a simple family misunderstanding. We're talking about premeditated, attempted homicide. Think carefully before deciding anything." The afternoon light that filtered through the lace curtains projected complex patterns on the wooden floor, dancing with each gentle breeze that stirred the yellowed fabric. The old ceiling fan turned lazily, emitting an occasional creak that marked the rhythm of the growing tension between the two friends. In the corner of the room, the old radio transmitted an instrumental melody in low volume that cruelly contrasted with the gravity of the situation. "Perhaps we should call the authorities right now," continued Nancy, leaning forward, her voice reduced to a conspiratorial whisper. "I have a nephew in the police who could—" Martha raised her hand, interrupting the suggestion with a firm gesture. "I can't simply turn him in, Nancy, not without trying to understand what led him to this," she replied, running her fingers through her grey hair with a deep sigh that carried the weight of 7 decades of life. "I need to face him, to see in his eyes if there's anything left of the boy I raised or if I've completely lost my son." The front door opened abruptly with a sharp creak of the poorly lubricated hinges, interrupting the conversation at its most crucial moment. The noise startled the tabby cat sleeping under the sofa, causing it to dash to another room like a fleeting shadow. A gust of warm air from the street invaded the environment, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and the distant sound of popular music playing in some neighboring house. Martha and Nancy exchanged alarmed looks, the silent communication of decades of friendship, conveying volumes of concern without the need for words. With the agility born of desperation, they quickly rearranged their expressions to mask the panic, Nancy discreetly hiding the photos of evidence under a crossword puzzle magazine. Michael entered the room carrying brown paper shopping bags that crackled rhythmically against his legs as he walked. Some beads of sweat purled on his forehead due to the afternoon heat, and he wiped them with the back of his hand in a casual gesture. His face displayed the artificially warm smile that Martha now recognized as a mask for his true intentions, lips stretched too much, eyes remaining cold and calculating even when his cheeks rose in a simulacrum of affection. "What a pleasant surprise to find you here, Nancy," he commented with studied cordiality, depositing the shopping bags on the side table with a dull thud. "I didn't know we would have visitors today." "I just stopped by to bring that herbal tea I promised your mother," Nancy replied, rising with a quickness that defied her advanced age. Her hands nervously smoothed her floral dress, leaving damp marks from sweaty palms on the fabric. "But I was just leaving. I need to return to feed my cats. You know how impatient they get around mealtime." Her laugh sounded artificial even to her own ears as she hastily collected her crochet bag and shawl, quickly escaping toward the door like a small animal fleeing from a predator before her expression could betray her newly acquired knowledge. "I'll be back tomorrow for our afternoon tea, Martha," she managed to say with impressive normalcy, though her eyes conveyed a silent message of caution. "Don't forget to take that medicine we discussed." Martha forced a maternal smile that didn't reach her eyes, the muscles in her face protesting against the falsity of the gesture. Her elderly hands, marked by decades of hard work, clutched the arm of the armchair as if seeking a point of support that was not merely physical, but emotional. "How was your walk, son? Did you find everything you needed?" she asked casually, her voice controlled in a tone of everyday interest that masked the underlying fear, while her heart hammered violently against her chest so forcefully that she feared he might hear it. Michael walked to the kitchen with light, almost dancing steps, placing the bags on the counter of yellowed tiles. The fluorescent light flickered a few times before stabilizing, casting an artificial brightness that accentuated the shadows under his eyes. "It was very productive," he replied, beginning to unpack the items methodically, organizing them into precise categories on the counter with the meticulousness that had always characterized him since childhood. "The market received fresh products today. I managed to find ingredients that rarely reach our town." He spoke animatedly about special recipes he planned to prepare, gesturing with exaggerated enthusiasm while describing complex culinary techniques. His hands moved gracefully through the air, like those of a conductor leading an invisible orchestra, as he detailed the ingredients selected specifically for their therapeutic benefits with a precision that bordered on obsessive. "Look at this imported saffron, Mom," he explained, holding a small amber vial against the light. "Excellent for inflammations and joint pains like yours." Among carefully packaged meats and fresh vegetables of vibrant colors, Martha glimpsed a discreet package of exotic spices with labels in a foreign language she had never used in her traditional kitchen. The package had no sanitary inspection seal, just a handwritten label with symbols she didn't recognize. With deliberately slow movements, due to the supposed weakness she had been feigning in recent days, she approached to better examine the purchases, leaning on the counter as if merely seeking support for her fragile body. "How interesting, son. I've never seen these seasonings before," she commented, noticing how Michael subtly shifted some items out of her sight with a casual movement of his elbow, sliding them behind a pile of ripe tomatoes. A small transparent vial quickly disappeared into his shirt pocket when he thought she was distracted with a bunch of aromatic herbs. "They're imported, Mum." "Very difficult to find," he replied with an enigmatic smile, his eyes briefly avoiding hers as he washed his hands in the sink with precise and methodical movements, scrubbing each finger individually like a surgeon preparing for an operation. "I have a friend who knows someone who works with direct imports." The running water created a sound curtain that filled the tense silence of the kitchen. In the backyard, a bird sang carelessly, oblivious to the drama unfolding within those walls. "Mum, tomorrow we'll have a special dinner just for the two of us," Michael announced with excessive enthusiasm when he finally turned off the faucet, meticulously drying his hands on an immaculately white dishcloth. He turned to face her, his eyes shining with a feverish anticipation that Martha now fully understood. It wasn't the glow of filial love, but the predatory gleam of a plan reaching its culmination. "I found a recipe that promises to renew your energy and speed up your recovery. It will be a memorable night, I guarantee." "I can hardly wait, my son," replied Martha, forcing a tone of gratitude while her mind quickly processed the hidden meaning behind those innocent words. A night that surely none of us will forget. The morning of the promised day dawned with a strange luminosity that cruelly contrasted with the darkness of the plans hatched under that roof. Martha awoke earlier than usual, her elderly eyes refusing to remain closed, while her mind spun in incessant circles of worry and planning. Lying in bed, she listened to the sounds of the house she knew so intimately. The slight creaking of the old wood, the distant whisper of wind at the windows, and Michael's furtive footsteps down the hallway, evidence that he too had not managed to sleep properly. The special dinner announced the previous day hung like a silent threat between them, a promise that carried radically different meanings for mother and son. Martha had spent the night in vigil, alternating between silent tears over the betrayal and meticulous planning for her survival. Nancy's words echoed in her mind. "Be smarter than him, Martha. Watch every move, don't lower your guard for even a second." The noise of pans in the kitchen confirmed her suspicions. Michael was already beginning preparations for what he hoped would be her last dinner. "May God give me strength to face my own son in this deadly game," she murmured to herself, making the sign of the cross with trembling fingers. "And may he forgive me for not seeing the darkness growing inside him all these years." With deliberately slow movements, Martha prepared herself for the day, choosing a simple dress she wore on special occasions, a navy blue piece with small embroidered flowers that Michael had complimented in his childhood. The bitter irony of the situation did not escape her, dressing carefully for a dinner prepared to kill her. At the mirror, she applied a light layer of powder to her pale face and a touch of lipstick to her colorless lips, not out of vanity, but as a form of armor, a mask to hide the fear and determination that alternated in her heart. Her fingers briefly touched the golden chain on her neck, a gift from her own mother, passed down through generations. And for a moment, she felt connected to a lineage of strong women who had faced their own battles. None of them had to fight against their own son, she thought bitterly. From downstairs, the smell of onions being sautéed and exotic spices began to rise, indicating that Michael was dedicating himself earnestly to preparing the fatal dinner. The aroma, which in another context would be inviting, now carried sinister notes that only Martha could detect. "Good morning, my son. What a wonderful smell is coming from the kitchen," she commented as she descended the stairs, firmly supporting herself on the handrail, her voice carefully modulated to hide the natural tremor. "I'm looking forward to the special dinner you promised." The kitchen, territory that Martha knew like the back of her hand after decades of preparing meals for her family, had been transformed into Michael's exclusive domain that day. Early on, he gently but firmly prevented her from crossing the doorway, insisting that she should rest while he took care of all the work. "It's a surprise, Mother. I want you to see only the final result," he explained with a smile that didn't reach his watchful eyes. Martha accepted with false gratitude, recognizing that insisting would only arouse suspicion. She strategically settled in the adjacent living room, in her favorite armchair positioned so that she could partially observe the kitchen activities through the reflection in the glass cabinet. The spectacle she witnessed throughout the day was disturbing in its duality. Michael moved with the precision of a professional chef, selecting ingredients, cutting, seasoning, and tasting with genuine culinary knowledge that she had never suspected he possessed. At the same time, she noticed moments when he furtively checked if he was being observed, before removing a small vial from his pocket, adding its contents to only one of the pans, carefully mixing to ensure it was evenly distributed. The naturalness with which he executed these movements revealed a disturbing familiarity with the process. Clearly, it was not the first time he had prepared such a special recipe. "Have some juice, Mother. I made it with fresh fruits especially for you," offered Michael in the middle of the afternoon, approaching with a glass of orange liquid carefully decorated with a slice of orange. "It will help open your appetite for our dinner." Martha accepted the glass with a grateful smile, her heart racing as she noticed the expectant gleam in her son's eyes. With calculated movements, she pretended to take small sips while only moistening her lips, carefully avoiding ingesting any amount of the potentially adulterated liquid. "It's delicious, Michael. So refreshing," she complimented, observing how he visibly relaxed with the confirmation that she had drunk. When he returned to the kitchen, Martha quickly poured the contents into a nearby plant pot, a strategy she had adopted in recent days to deal with food and drinks offered by him. The living room clock mercilessly marked the passage of hours, each tick-tock bringing her closer to the inevitable confrontation. As the afternoon progressed, the aromas from the kitchen intensified. A rich and complex stew, saffron rice, grilled vegetables, all prepared with undeniable culinary skill. The house, which had once been a sanctuary of maternal love, had transformed into a macabre theater where mother and son played roles in a deadly play. "I'm putting so much love into every dish, Mother. I want it to be an unforgettable night for both of us," Michael shouted from the kitchen, his voice carrying an ambiguity that only Martha understood. "After today, everything will be different in our lives." The final hours before dinner passed in growing tension that Martha masked perfectly, the result of decades hiding financial concerns and difficulties to protect her son, the same son who now planned her end. As dusk approached, Michael briefly emerged from the kitchen to request that she get ready for dinner, as if it were a truly festive occasion. "I put that beige dress of yours in the bathroom, Mother. The one you always say is your favorite for special occasions," he suggested, with a solicitude that would once have warmed her maternal heart. Martha docilely agreed, recognizing the subtle manipulation. Michael was trying to control even her appearance in this final act. In the bath, she allowed herself a few minutes of vulnerability, letting silent tears mix with the hot water running down her wrinkled face. She wasn't crying out of fear of death, which at 70 no longer seemed such a frightening stranger, but for the definitive loss of the son she had loved so much, for the confirmation that the bright-eyed boy she had raised with such sacrifice had transformed into a monster capable of coldly murdering for money. When dressing, she refused the dress suggested by Michael, opting again for navy blue, a small but significant assertion of autonomy in this battle of wills. "It's not the dress I suggested, Mother," Michael observed when she came down the stairs, his falsely light tone barely disguising his irritation at the small act of rebellion. "But you look beautiful, as always. The blue matches your eyes." The dinner table had been transformed with care that would have moved Martha under other circumstances. The lace tablecloth she preserved for special occasions perfectly covered the ancient wood. Porcelain plates inherited from her own mother gleamed under the soft light of strategically positioned candles to create an intimate and welcoming atmosphere. Fresh flowers in an elaborate arrangement occupied the center, their soft perfume mixing with the tempting aromas emanating from the kitchen. Rarely used crystals reflected the golden light of the flames, transforming water droplets into small sparkling diamonds. The meticulous attention to detail revealed extensive planning. Michael had repeatedly imagined this scene, visualizing each element of what he expected to be his mother's last meal. Martha observed in silence as he lit the last candles, pretending admiration for the effort, when in fact she was studying each movement, evaluating opportunities, mentally preparing for what would come next. The table had been arranged so they would sit face to face, a configuration that would allow Michael to observe each of her reactions to the poison he planned to serve. "I prepared your favorite dish, Mother. That meat stew with vegetables you always made on special Sundays," he announced with evidently rehearsed pride. "I hope I've managed to come close to your legendary recipe." The performance continued as Michael served wine in delicate glasses, insisting that the occasion deserved a small indulgence, even with the medications she took. Martha noticed how he served from different bottles, one for her, another for himself, with a movement so fluid it would go unnoticed by less attentive eyes. She raised her glass in the toast he proposed, bringing it to her lips without really drinking, observing over the crystal rim how he comfortably swallowed the contents of his own glass. "To new beginnings," he proposed with involuntary irony that only Martha fully understood. The true test began when Michael brought the main courses, serving them like a professional from a 5-star restaurant. Two seemingly identical dishes, both emanating delicious aromas of herbs and spices, were carefully positioned, one in front of her, another in front of him. The only perceptible difference to Martha's trained eye was the slightly distinct arrangement of vegetables, a visual marker he used to differentiate the poisoned dish. "Try it first, Mother." "I want to see your honest reaction to my first stew," Michael insisted, his eyes fixed on her with an almost predatory intensity. "I promise I put all my heart into this recipe." Martha felt the crucial moment approaching like an inexorable wave. With deliberately slow movements, appropriate for her age and physical condition, she brought her fork to the stew, carefully selecting a piece of carrot from the edge of the plate. The expectation on Michael's face was almost palpable, his eyes not missing a single movement of her wrinkled fingers. "It smells wonderful, son," she commented softly, bringing the fork to her lips without actually inserting the food into her mouth. A technique she had secretly practiced in recent days, simulating chewing while keeping the food hidden in her hand. The aroma emanating from the plate confirmed her suspicions. Beneath the layers of traditional seasonings, she detected a strange, slightly metallic fragrance that didn't belong to the original recipe she herself had created decades ago. Michael observed with disturbing intensity, leaning slightly forward, his fingers softly drumming on the table in a nervous rhythm that betrayed his anxiety. "Isn't it too hot? I can cool it down a bit for you," he offered with false concern when he noticed her hesitation. "I want you to enjoy every flavor I prepared especially for you." The opportunity Martha had been waiting for came unexpectedly, but was welcome. The phone in the kitchen rang shrilly, interrupting the macabre ritual unfolding at the table. Michael visibly hesitated, torn between ignoring the call or answering it. "It must be Nancy checking on me as she always does," Martha commented casually, knowing that the fear of appearing suspicious would force Michael to maintain appearances. "You should answer it, son. She would be worried if she couldn't talk to me today." After a moment of indecision, Michael reluctantly rose, casting a final glance at the still untouched plate. "Don't start without me, Mother. I want to see your reaction to the first bite," he insisted, before quickly heading to the kitchen where the phone continued ringing insistently. The seconds that followed were precious. With the surprising agility that only the adrenaline of imminent danger could provide to a woman of her age, Martha quickly switched the plates, making sure to reproduce exactly the same position of the cutlery and napkins. Her heart pounded violently against her chest as she completed the exchange, her ears attentive to the conversation in the kitchen that fortunately prolonged beyond what was expected. "Was it really Nancy?" Martha asked innocently when Michael returned, her face displaying the same placid smile she had maintained throughout the staging. "I hope we didn't interrupt anything important with our dedicated neighbor." Michael's expression oscillated between barely contained irritation and the mask of devoted son he insisted on maintaining. "Yes, she just wanted to know if we needed anything from the bakery tomorrow morning," he answered distractedly, his eyes immediately seeking Martha's plate to check if she had eaten in his absence. The visible relief in his expression upon finding that the plate remained apparently untouched revealed how much he feared missing the moment of the first ingestion of poison. Settling back into his chair, Michael resumed the charade with renewed enthusiasm, insisting that both should start the meal simultaneously to celebrate properly. Martha agreed with a serene smile that masked the internal emotional turmoil. She was about to witness her own son poison himself with the death he had planned for her. For a painful moment, she considered intervening, revealing that she knew his plans, preventing him from ingesting the poison he himself had prepared. But the recent discovery of the extent of his betrayal had hardened something inside her. She would not allow him to kill her, but she would not prevent him from experiencing the consequences of his own actions either. "Let's eat then, son. Let's not let this meal prepared with so much. Love grow cold," suggested Martha, watching attentively as Michael confidently brought the first fork to his mouth. "Let's toast once more to this unique moment between mother and son." Michael savored the first forkful with an expression of genuine gastronomic pleasure, clearly proud of his culinary skills, regardless of the sinister purpose of the meal. "Delicious, isn't it, Mother? Did I manage to capture the flavor you always created?" he asked enthusiastically while chewing, his eyes fixed on the fork that Martha slowly brought to her own lips. She pretended to taste the food, simulating appreciation while discreetly depositing the food in the napkin on her lap, a trick she had perfected in recent weeks. "Extraordinary, Michael. I never imagined you had inherited my talent in the kitchen," she responded with false enthusiasm, observing how he continued to eat with appetite, apparently satisfied that both were consuming the meal as planned. The dinner proceeded in this macabre ballet for several minutes, Michael eating with growing pleasure, Martha pretending to enjoy small portions while secretly discarding each forkful. The conversation flowed surprisingly naturally, with reminiscences of his childhood, vague plans for the future, discussions about recent news, as if it were really just a dinner of reconnection between mother and son, not the calculated scenario for a murder. "You know, Mother, I've been thinking about perhaps staying permanently," commented Michael between generous forkfuls, his voice assuming a falsely contemplative tone. "Taking care of you could become my priority from now on." The transformation began subtly, so gradually that initially Michael seemed not to notice. A slight tremor in his hand when raising the wine glass, a momentary hesitation in the middle of a sentence, a growing pallor that slowly spread across his previously excitement-flushed face. Martha observed in silence, her maternal heart broken by what she witnessed, but her determination unwavering. Michael set down his fork confusedly, his forehead furrowed in confusion, as he tried to process the strange sensations that were beginning to take over his body. He brought his hand to his throat, which was clearly beginning to close, making his breathing difficult. His eyes, initially just intrigued, gradually widened with horrified recognition of what was happening. A trickle of cold sweat ran down his temple as he tried to stand up, only to discover that his limbs responded with increasing difficulty to his brain's commands. The terrible calculation became clear in his contorted expression. He was experiencing exactly the symptoms he had planned to inflict on his mother. "What is happening?" murmured Michael, his voice already hoarse and weakened, bloodshot eyes fixing on Martha's with growing comprehension. "I feel something wrong." The following minutes unfolded like a nightmare scene in slow motion. Michael tried to stand up abruptly, knocking over the chair with a crash that echoed through the silent dining room. His movements became increasingly uncoordinated, hands trembling violently as he tried to support himself on the table to maintain balance. The full understanding of the situation was now reflected in his wide eyes, horror mixing with disbelief as his gaze alternated between his own plate and Martha's. "Impossible," he murmured almost inaudibly, his mind still trying to process how his foolproof plan had turned against him. Martha remained seated, motionless as a statue, her face a mask of calm that hid the whirlwind of contradictory emotions. The deep pain of seeing her son suffer, battling against the bitter satisfaction of seeing justice done by his own hands. Michael staggered backward, knocking over the wine bottle that shattered on the floor, spreading red liquid like blood across the wooden floor. His breathing became more laborious with each second. The poison he had carefully selected to resemble a natural death in an elderly woman now attacked his own nervous system with relentless efficiency. "What did you do?" He managed to articulate between painful spasms, clutching his own throat as if he could physically prevent the poison from spreading. "How did you know?" Michael's body finally gave way completely, his legs folding under his weight like dry branches during a violent storm. The expensive fabric of his pants tore slightly at the knee when he tried, in a last desperate effort, to grab the edge of the table. The lace tablecloth slipped along with his trembling fingers, dragging with it the flower arrangement that toppled in slow motion, petals dispersing through the air like macabre confetti in a celebration of death. The delicate crystals, a family heirloom that Martha kept for special occasions, shattered against the ancient wooden floor, fragmenting into hundreds of glittering pieces that now reflected the candlelight like fallen stars. He fell heavily from his chair, landing with a dull thud that reverberated through the silent house, causing the remaining crystals and the pictures on the walls to vibrate. The old pendulum clock in the hallway seemed to mark the seconds with cruel slowness, each tick-tock amplified by the oppressive silence, interrupted only by the guttural sounds involuntarily escaping from Michael's throat. "Eduardo," Martha finally pronounced, her voice hoarse with emotion, breaking her son's name into painful syllables, as if each one carried the weight of decades of hopes and disappointments. On the floor, among glass shards and wine stains, Michael began to show symptoms. His body, always so controlled, now reacted involuntarily as he struggled to maintain consciousness. The suit carefully chosen for the occasion, for what should have been his mother's last dinner, twisted around his body like an uncomfortable second skin. His eyes, bloodshot and widened by panic, never left Martha's, fixed as if she were the only anchor in a world that was quickly dissolving around him. "Why?" He managed to articulate with extreme difficulty, the word escaping like a strangled sigh between his trembling lips. In that gaze was a silent question mingled with the growing terror of one facing his own mortality unexpectedly. It wasn't just fear of death, but the total incomprehension of someone whose meticulous plan had turned against its creator, like a mythological creature devouring its own inventor. "What would you do in my place?" Martha responded with a question that expected no answer, her voice broken by contained emotion. Tears flowed freely down Martha's wrinkled face, creating small saline rivers between the marks time had sculpted on her skin. Droplets hung momentarily on her chin before falling onto her navy blue dress, forming small dark spots that slowly expanded in the fabric like aquatic flowers blooming. These were not tears of regret for switching the plates, nor of vindictive satisfaction for the poetic justice unfolding before her, but for the son she had lost long before this fateful night, for the maternal love that, against all logic and reason, stubbornly persisted even in the face of the deepest betrayal. "I loved you always," she whispered, words she didn't know if they were directed at the dying man on the floor or at the boy he had been, that bright-eyed child who had once promised to always protect her. Michael extended a trembling hand toward her, an ambiguous gesture between supplication and accusation. His lips had lost their color, moving silently as he fought against the effects of the substance. The poison was fulfilling its purpose with devastating efficiency, methodically attacking each vital system, exactly as detailed in the meticulous notes Michael had studied for weeks, exactly as he had planned. Just not on the originally intended victim. Time seemed to freeze in that terrible instant, the entire universe reduced to the dining room, where Michael convulsed on the floor among glass shards and spilled wine. Martha remained motionless for a few seconds that seemed like eternities, her elderly body paralyzed by the magnitude of what had just happened. It wasn't just her son writhing before her. It was the boy she had cradled on feverish nights, the teenager she had taught to drive, the man who, despite all his mistakes, still carried within him fragments of the son she had so loved. His condition was rapidly worsening, exactly as he had planned to happen to his mother. The cruel irony did not escape Martha, who saw her son facing the fate he had prepared for her. His eyes, widened with terror and incomprehension, silently pleaded for help as his consciousness began to waver. It was that look, so similar to the frightened child who ran into her arms during storms, that finally broke Martha's trance. The revenge that for a brief moment had satisfied her sense of justice now evaporated before the maternal love that, even betrayed in the worst possible way, refused to be completely extinguished. My God, what am I doing? I can't let him die like this, she whispered to herself, the initial shock giving way to the urgency of action. Even after everything, he's still my son. With surprising agility for someone her age, Martha abruptly stood up, knocking over her own chair in the process. Completely ignoring the persistent pain in her newly recovered hip, she moved quickly toward the corridor leading to the stairs. Each step sent waves of sharp pain through her injured leg, but desperation provided her with a strength that defied her physical limitations. She climbed the steps almost running, grabbing the handrail only to maintain balance while her knees protested against the sudden effort. Her breathing became labored, her heart beating so violently that it seemed to want to escape from her chest. The physical pain, however, was insignificant compared to the emotional torment consuming her. The same hand that now reached out to save her son had moments before consciously allowed him to ingest the poison. She reached the top of the stairs almost breathless, heading immediately to Michael's room. The door remained locked, a result of her earlier distrust, but Martha didn't hesitate. She grabbed a small decorative vase from the hallway and threw it against the doorknob with a force born of pure desperation. The metal gave way with a satisfying crack after the second attempt, allowing the door to violently swing open. "Hold on, Michael. I won't let you die, not like this, not by my hands," she muttered, while frantically searching the room, looking for the hiding place she had discovered days before. A mother protects, even when protection isn't deserved. The antidote vial was exactly where Martha had seen it during her investigation with Nancy, carefully hidden in a fake pill box for pain at the bottom of Michael's suitcase. Her hands, trembling from age and panic, could barely open the small container, her arthritic fingers struggling against the safety cap. A muffled cry of frustration escaped her lips as she tried repeatedly, hearing in the distance the distressing sounds of Michael's convulsions downstairs. Finally, the cap gave way, revealing a slightly viscous, transparent liquid, accompanied by a disposable syringe sealed in plastic. Martha recalled the detailed instructions she had found in her son's notes. The poison was potent, but quick treatment with the antidote could reverse the effects if administered in the early stages of symptoms. With precious seconds relentlessly slipping away, she filled the syringe with the indicated amount, double-checking the dosage despite the urgency. The irony didn't escape her. She was meticulously following the instructions Michael had noted for the eventual case where he needed to reverse the poisoning if something went wrong in his original plan. She had never imagined, however, that she would use the antidote on him. "Please work. No matter what he did, I don't deserve to carry the weight of his death for the rest of my days," she silently pleaded as she descended the stairs with the syringe firmly secured, each step a battle against pain and fear. "I can't lose my son twice." The scene she found upon returning to the dining room was even more terrifying. Michael had stopped convulsing, his body now dangerously motionless, except for occasional spasms, his breathing almost imperceptible. His lips had acquired an alarming bluish tone, and his eyes, though still open, had a glazed look indicating he was rapidly losing the battle against the poison. Ignoring the glass shards cutting her bare feet, Martha knelt beside her son, desperately seeking the pulse in his neck. It was there, weak, irregular, but present, a tenuous thread of hope to which she clung with all her strength. With hands that miraculously stopped trembling at the crucial moment, she positioned the needle on Michael's exposed arm, exactly as indicated in the instructions, in the main muscle of the forearm. The injection was applied with surprising precision, the liquid quickly penetrating the bloodstream. Martha vigorously massaged the injection site to accelerate absorption, her eyes fixed on her son's face, anxiously seeking any sign of improvement. The first seconds were of agonizing silence, with no perceptible change in the critical condition. "Fight, Michael, please. I won't give up on you, even if you've given up on me," she whispered in his ear, tears falling freely onto her son's motionless face. A mother never gives up, never. The following minutes passed in a tense vigil, Martha alternating between massaging the arm where she had applied the injection and checking Michael's vital signs. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, small changes began to manifest. His breathing, previously shallow and irregular, slowly acquired a more constant rhythm. The bluish coloration of his lips subtly receded, giving way to a less alarming tone. The muscle spasms decreased in frequency and intensity. Michael remained unconscious, but Martha noticed with growing relief that the antidote was fulfilling its purpose, fighting the poison, stabilizing the basic bodily functions that were rapidly collapsing. Pushing away sweaty strands of hair from her son's forehead, she noticed how his face now seemed strangely peaceful, almost childlike in its abandonment, painfully reminding her of the boy he had once been. The vulnerability of that moment cruelly contrasted with the calculating coldness with which he had planned her death. Martha knew, however, that the antidote was just the first step. Michael would need professional medical attention to ensure his complete recovery and monitor possible damage to internal organs. "We need to get you to the hospital immediately, son." "The antidote is working, but I can't risk it," she murmured, painfully rising to reach the phone on the side table. "I'll have to tell the truth, at least part of it." With fingers still trembling from the adrenaline that was beginning to subside, Martha dialed the emergency number. "I need an ambulance urgently," she explained, with a surprisingly firm voice when they answered. "My son ingested something that caused a severe allergic reaction. He's unconscious but breathing." She provided the address in detail, emphasizing the urgency of the situation. Upon hanging up, she immediately returned to Michael's side, whose eyes were now completely closed, but whose breathing continued to gradually stabilize. The relief of seeing him responding to the antidote mixed with anxiety about what would come next. The inevitable questions, the necessary explanations, the confrontation with the truth that could no longer be avoided. While waiting for the ambulance, Martha began to gently clean her son's face with a damp napkin, removing the remains of foam and sweat. The automatic gesture of maternal care was the same she had repeated countless times over decades, from the first childhood colds to teenage sports injuries. "You tried to kill me, Michael, but I couldn't let you die," she said softly to her unconscious son. The words that flowed now would inaugurate the inevitable confrontation when he woke up. "What kind of monsters have we become in this terrible game?" When the distant sound of the siren finally cut through the oppressive silence of the house, Martha had made her decision. She would not immediately reveal the complete truth to the paramedics. She would say only that she suspected severe food poisoning, perhaps mentioning the exotic mushrooms that Michael had included in the stew. This half-truth would gain precious time, allowing Michael to receive the necessary treatment while she determined how to proceed. The quick steps and professional voices approaching the door indicated that the moment of separation was near. Leaning over her son, Martha whispered words that he could not hear in his unconscious state, but that needed to be said, both for him and for herself, a declaration of intentions that would define what was to come. "You will live, Michael, and you will have to face what you tried to do. When you wake up, I'll be there, not as a victim, but as a witness to your darkest attempt. I don't know if I can forgive, but I know I won't allow the poison of hatred to consume what's left of us both." The paramedics worked with professional efficiency, quickly assessing Michael's vital signs and preparing him for transport. Martha watched attentively, answering questions with a carefully calculated mixture of genuine maternal concern and feigned confusion about what could have caused the reaction. "We were just having dinner when he started feeling ill," she explained, deliberately omitting the switching of plates and the entire sinister context that had preceded the incident. "He cooked today, wanted to surprise me with a special dish." The paramedics exchanged meaningful glances when noticing the remains of the meal, one of them discreetly collecting samples from the dishes for later analysis, standard procedure in cases of suspected severe intoxication. While preparing Michael for transfer to the ambulance, one of the professionals approached Martha, explaining that they would also need to take food samples to identify possible toxins. The tension in her stomach intensified with this information. Detailed analyses would eventually reveal the presence of poison, raising questions she could not indefinitely avoid. "Do whatever is necessary to save my son," she responded with absolute sincerity. despite the complications she knew would come. "I'll bring some samples with me when I go to the hospital." The journey to the hospital transpired in a blur of sirens, technical voices exchanging medical information, and the rhythmic swaying of the ambulance that gradually distanced itself from the house that had been the stage for so much betrayal. Seated beside the stretcher where Michael remained unconscious but stable, Martha held his hand tightly, as if through that physical contact she could transmit her determination not to abandon him, despite everything. The paramedic constantly monitored his vital signs, administering intravenous fluids to combat the dehydration caused by vomiting and convulsions. "He's strong, he'll recover," commented the professional, misinterpreting Martha's anguished expression as fear for her son's life. The irony of the situation didn't escape her. The man couldn't imagine that the silent tears running down her wrinkled cheeks were for a loss much deeper than physical death. In her mind, she replayed the events that had brought them to this moment, trying to understand how the loving boy she had raised had transformed into a man capable of coldly planning her murder. She wondered where she had failed as a mother, what signs she had missed, what decisive moments could have altered the course of their lives if they had been faced differently. "I came to believe that you had returned to me, that the miracle I had prayed for years had happened," she thought while observing her son's unconscious face, so peaceful now compared to the mask of hatred and shock he had displayed upon realizing he had been poisoned. What a fool I was, mistaking greed for remorse. Upon arriving at the hospital, Martha was temporarily separated from Michael while the medical team transferred him to the emergency room for complete evaluation and treatment. Led to a small private waiting room, she was informed that a doctor would update her as soon as they had a more precise diagnosis. The minutes of solitary waiting seemed to extend indefinitely, each second carrying the weight of the decisions she would need to make. Eventually she would need to reveal the truth, if not to the authorities, at least to Michael when he regained consciousness. The prospect of this inevitable confrontation made her heart race with apprehension. What words could possibly express the complexity of her feelings? How would she face her son's eyes knowing that he had planned her death, and that she, in turn, had almost allowed his? Chaotic thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the doctor, a middle-aged man with a grave expression, who introduced himself as responsible for Michael's case. "Your son is stable now, ma'am. We managed to reverse the most severe effects of the intoxication, but we still haven't identified exactly the substance responsible," he explained, observing her attentively while speaking. "The initial toxicological tests suggest something more complex than simple food poisoning. Do you have any idea what he might have ingested?" The question hung heavily between them, loaded with implications that the doctor probably didn't yet fully understand. Martha felt the weight of the choice before her: lie to protect Michael, or begin to reveal the terrible truth that would eventually come to light. She opted for an intermediate path, providing partial information that didn't immediately compromise her son, but also didn't commit her to an elaborate lie that she wouldn't be able to sustain later. "He prepared a special dinner today, with ingredients we had never used before. He mentioned exotic mushrooms and some herbs that he bought especially for the occasion," she answered, maintaining a steady gaze despite her internal discomfort. "Can I see him now? I need to be present when he wakes up." The doctor hesitated briefly, clearly intrigued by Martha's contained reaction to the serious situation, but nodded after a few moments. "He's being transferred to a room where you can accompany him, but I should warn you that the police have requested samples of the food for analysis. In cases of severe intoxication like this, it's standard procedure to investigate the source." "I understand perfectly, Doctor. I'll do everything possible to help with the investigation," she responded with a calmness that surprised even herself. "I want to discover exactly what happened tonight as much as you do." The hospital room where Michael had been transferred was a sterile and impersonal space, dominated by the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors and the soft hum of supplemental oxygen. Lying in bed with tubes and sensors connected to his body, he seemed strangely diminished, vulnerable in a way that Martha would never associate with the calculating man who had so meticulously planned her death. She sat in the chair beside the bed, preparing herself for the vigil she knew would come. The doctors had explained that he would probably wake up in the next few hours as the sedatives administered during the emergency procedures lost their effect. This period of unconsciousness offered Martha a precious interval to order her thoughts and decide how she would proceed when her son's eyes finally opened. Part of her longed to confront him immediately with the complete truth, to unload all the pain and betrayal she had felt upon discovering his homicidal plans. Another part, however, the mother who persisted despite everything, was reluctant to attack someone in such a vulnerable state, someone who, despite his intentional crimes, was still her own flesh and blood. "When you open your eyes, Michael, what will you see in me? The mother who always tried to protect you, or just an obstacle in your path to the money you so desire?" she whispered to the motionless figure, gently caressing his inert hand. "And what will I see in you? My son or the stranger who tried to kill me?" The hours passed slowly as Martha maintained her silent vigil, watching every small movement, every fluctuation in the monitors that might indicate changes in Michael's condition. Nurses came and went regularly, checking vital signs, adjusting medications, offering Martha coffee or water that she invariably refused. The early morning hours advanced, gradually transforming into a pale dawn that filtered timidly through the partially closed blinds. It was in this grey liminal light between night and day that she noticed the first signs of awakening. A subtle movement of fingers, a change in the breathing pattern, a slight contraction in the eyelids that were beginning to fight against the weight of unconsciousness. She sat more erect, her entire body tense with anticipation, her heart involuntarily accelerating as she watched her son slowly emerge from the depths of induced sleep. Michael's eyes finally opened, unfocused and confused at first, blinking repeatedly against the soft light of the room. For a few moments, he seemed completely disoriented, his gaze wandering without comprehension around the strange environment. Then slowly, consciousness and memory began to return, reflected in the sudden change in his expression when his gaze finally met Martha's. You switched the plates," he murmured in a hoarse and weak voice, the first words carrying not remorse or shame but incredulous accusation. "How did you know?" The moment of truth had arrived, inevitable as the dawn that now fully illuminated the hospital room. Martha straightened in her chair, her tired eyes firmly meeting Michael's. There was no more room for half-truths or evasions. The confrontation she had tried to delay was finally before her, demanding courage she wasn't sure she possessed. But as she observed the son who had planned her murder, she felt a surprising calm replace her previous anxiety. The truth, however painful it might be, was the only possible path now, for both of them. In a low but firm voice, she began to reveal everything she knew, each word carefully chosen to convey not just the facts, but also the depth of betrayal she had felt. "I know everything, Michael. The falsification of the life insurance, your debts to loan sharks, the vial of poison hidden among your clothes," she explained methodically, observing how each revelation made his face pale even more. "I found your detailed notes about how the poison would work, how it would look like a natural death in an elderly woman with my medical condition. I saw the calculations of how much money you would receive from my death." Michael's expression transformed as Martha continued her relentless exposition, the initial shock giving way to a mixture of shame and defensive calculation. He tried to speak, probably to deny or justify himself, but she raised her hand, silencing him with a firm gesture that would accept no interruptions. This was her moment to speak, to finally express the pain of a mother confronted with the deepest of betrayals. She continued detailing how she had discovered every aspect of the plan, how she had observed his elaborate performance as a devoted son while he gradually poisoned her, how she had realized his intentions long before the fatal dinner. She spoke about the nights she had silently cried, divided between the horror of what he was planning and the desperate hope that she might be wrong. She mentioned Nancy only briefly, protecting her friend from any possible retaliation, presenting the discoveries as the result of her own investigation. As the truth unfolded between them, she saw something in Michael's gaze that she hadn't expected. Not regret or remorse, but a cold calculation, as if he were still evaluating options, seeking a way out of the incriminating situation. "The most painful part wasn't discovering that you wanted to kill me, Michael," she finally said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time. "It was realizing that you didn't hesitate for even a second, that there was no moral conflict in your heart. Your own mother, reduced to nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated for money. The silence that followed her words was oppressive, loaded with exposed truths that could not be collected back or denied. Michael seemed smaller in the hospital bed, his usual arrogance temporarily subdued by the precarious situation in which he found himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was a mixture of defensiveness and accusation, still unable to take full responsibility for what he had done. "You don't understand the pressures I face, the threats against my life if I don't pay my debts," he argued, his eyes deliberately avoiding hers. "I had no choice. They would kill me if I didn't get the money quickly." Martha listened to the pathetic justification with a calmness that surprised even herself. There was a time when such excuses would have awakened her maternal sympathy, her instinctive desire to protect her son regardless of his mistakes. Now she clearly saw the manipulation behind the words, the transparent attempt to awaken pity to escape the consequences. With a soft but firm voice, she responded to his inadequate defense, determined not to let him escape the truth of his actions. "We all have choices, Michael. You could have asked for my help, could have been honest about your difficulties. Instead, you chose to poison me slowly, pretending love while planning my death. What kind of desperation justifies turning your own mother into a victim?" Before Michael could elaborate more justifications, the door to the room opened, interrupting the charged confrontation between mother and son. A middle-aged man in formal attire entered, accompanied by a nurse who briefly checked Michael's vital signs before discreetly withdrawing. The man introduced himself as a detective, briefly showing an official identification. His impassive face revealed little about his intentions, but the folder he carried and his professional posture indicated that this was not a routine visit. Martha felt the tension in the room instantly intensify, Michael visibly stiffening in the hospital bed, his calculating eyes now fixed on the newcomer. The detective pulled up a chair, sitting on the other side of the bed, creating a configuration that literally placed Michael between justice and the mother he had tried to murder. The silence extended for a few uncomfortable moments before the officer finally spoke, his deliberately neutral voice contradicting the gravity of his words. "Mr. Michael, I'm here to ask some questions about tonight's incident," he began methodically, opening the folder and removing some notes. "Preliminary tests detected suspicious substances in the food samples collected from your home. Substances that don't correspond to any known culinary ingredient." The impact of the detective's words was instantaneous and visible. Michael's face, already pale from the near-death experience and the previous confrontation with Martha, acquired an almost translucent quality, like fine porcelain exposed to a strong light. Bluish veins suddenly became visible at his temples, pulsing with the accelerated rhythm of his treacherous heart. A microscopic tremor began at the left corner of his mouth, a failure in muscle control that he tried to disguise by slightly biting his lower lip. His eyes, previously calculating and cold, now reflected pure panic, the pupils dramatically dilating, almost swallowing all the brown of his irises as he realized that concrete physical evidence had been collected. The fluorescent hospital light, merciless in its clinical clarity, accentuated every micro-expression of guilt and terror on his countenance. The heart monitor beside the bed recorded a sudden increase in frequency, its monotonous beep accelerating, like the ticking of a countdown clock. Martha silently observed this transformation of her son, seated in the hard plastic chair that creaked slightly when she adjusted to better observe the scene. A heavy knot formed in her stomach, dense as lead, as she understood that the moment of final decision was approaching with the inevitability of a rising tide. The smell of hospital antiseptic filled her lungs with each tense breath, mixing with the slight odor of cold sweat emanating from Michael. "These substances," continued the detective, methodically leafing through his notes, the sound of paper echoing in the tense silence of the room, "present characteristics consistent with compounds normally associated with intentional poisonings." His fingers, rough and marked by years of police service, stopped on a specific page, the index finger silently underlining a paragraph that he deliberately kept out of Michael and Martha's visual range. "We have very interesting preliminary results," he added, his seemingly casual tone contrasting with the intensity of his gaze. "Compounds that don't appear in any registry of known culinary ingredients." The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, a gurney being pushed somewhere distant. The constant beeping of monitoring devices formed a background symphony for the silent drama unfolding in the small room. She would have to choose right there whether to protect her son from the crimes he undeniably committed or allow justice to follow its natural course. The small worn crucifix that Martha always carried in the pocket of her dress suddenly seemed heavier, pressing against her thigh like a physical reminder of the moral weight of her imminent decision. It was an impossible choice for any mother, even one who had been the target of an attempted murder by her own son. The laboratory identified traces of a particularly potent substance, the detective continued, detailing the evidence found, his finger sliding over the paper as he spoke. A nurse passed by the room, slowing briefly to curiously look through the partially open door before proceeding. More detailed analyses are underway, and toxicology experts have been consulted to precisely identify the substance. The IV bag hanging beside the bed dripped rhythmically, each drop falling with almost chronometric timing, as if marking the remaining seconds before an inevitable confession. Michael cast a desperate look at Martha, his eyes wide and moist, a silent plea that transcended words. She immediately recognized that expression, the same one he used in childhood when he broke something valuable and begged not to be punished. Now, however, there was no childishness in that look, only the adult desperation of someone begging for her intervention, for a saving lie that only she could offer, for a final act of maternal love that would protect him from the consequences of his deepest betrayal. "I would like to clarify what kind of relationship you maintain, Mrs. Martha." The detective turned to her unexpectedly, the leather of his chair creaking as he shifted position, leaning slightly toward her. The pen in his hand hovered expectantly over his notebook, ready to record every word. His expression, apparently neutral but with intensely observant eyes, revealed that he already suspected something beyond a simple culinary accident. "And if there was any reason why your son might want to cause you harm." The old colonial mansion that now housed the Forgotten Hearts Foundation gleamed under the morning sun, its freshly painted walls in soft terracotta tones harmoniously contrasting with the meticulously tended gardens surrounding it. 2 years had passed since that fateful night of the poisoned dinner, 2 years of profound transformations for both Martha and Michael. What had begun as a small initiative in a rented property had transformed into a respected institution, now occupying this imposing property on the outskirts of the city. The wide corridors, once silent and abandoned, now echoed with the animated voices of elderly women who had found there not just shelter, but a true substitute family. Martha walked slowly through the inner garden, leaning on her cane, observing with discreet satisfaction the harmonious movement of the institution she had created with her fortune. Ladies of various ages, all with similar stories of family abandonment, occupied themselves in different activities, some tending to exuberant flowers, others practicing crafts under the generous shade of ancient trees. The sound of occasional laughter and animated conversations filled the air, a living testimony to the welcoming environment she had managed to create. More impressive, however, was observing her son, the same Michael who 2 years earlier had coldly planned her murder, now patiently kneeling beside an elderly lady, helping her plant violet seedlings in a flower bed specially adapted for gardeners with reduced mobility. "I never imagined that the greatest tragedy of my life would transform into the greatest blessing for so many people," Martha murmured to herself, observing the scene with a mixture of pride and melancholy. The poison that almost destroyed us ended up being the remedy that saved not only us but dozens of lonely souls. The path that had brought them here had been tortuous and painful. After that night in the hospital, with the detective questioning the strange case of poisoning, Martha had made the most difficult decision of her life. Confronted with the choice between handing her son over to conventional justice or seeking an alternative form of accountability, she had opted for an intermediate path that not even she initially believed possible. Using her contacts with a retired judge she had met through Nancy, she managed to negotiate a unique judicial agreement. Michael would confess to his attempted homicide, but instead of serving his sentence in a conventional prison, he would remain under monitored probation, obligated to work at the foundation Martha had proposed creating for abandoned elderly people. At first, the proposal faced significant resistance from the case prosecutor, outraged by the apparent leniency for such a serious crime. It took all of Martha's eloquence and persuasion, added to her condition as a victim pleading for this alternative solution, to finally convince the authorities. What good would it do society to keep my son locked up among hardened criminals when he can repair his mistake by helping exactly those who suffer most from family abandonment? She had passionately argued in the decisive hearing. The final agreement established rigorous conditions. Michael would work 6 days a week at the foundation, using his administrative skills and practice in elderly care without compensation beyond basic lodging and food. Any violation would result in immediate revocation of probation and fulfillment of the original sentence in closed regime. "It was the hardest decision I've ever made, Nancy," Martha had confessed to her friend during the foundation's first days, as they watched Michael performing his tasks with evident reluctance. "I still don't know if I chose the right path, or just let myself be carried away once again by a mother's heart that refuses to give up." The first months had been extremely challenging. Michael, still processing the consequences of his actions and the humiliation of the public exposure the case had inevitably generated, showed himself rebellious and resentful. He fulfilled his obligations with the minimum effort possible, avoiding genuine interactions with the residents and treating each task as an unjust punishment. His bitter and distant attitude created a tense environment, especially for the more perceptive elderly women who quickly perceived the complicated relationship between mother and son. Martha observed from a distance, resisting the temptation to interfere directly, understanding that any genuine transformation would need to come from within. She focused on developing the foundation's infrastructure, wisely using her fortune to acquire specialized equipment, hire dedicated health professionals, and create innovative therapeutic programs. Meanwhile, she allowed Michael to find his own way through forced labor, trusting that daily contact with stories of abandonment similar to what he himself had inflicted could eventually penetrate the defensive shell he had built around himself. There were weeks of heavy silences during shared meals, looks laden with resentment from him, and cautious hope from her. "I'm not punishing you, Michael. I'm offering an opportunity for redemption that few would receive," she patiently repeated when he questioned the necessity of particularly unpleasant tasks like changing diapers or feeding residents with reduced mobility. "So you call this an opportunity? It's a prison disguised as charity," he had bitterly responded in the first months, his eyes still unable to hold her gaze for more than a few seconds. "It would have been more merciful to hand me over to the police at once." The change, when it finally began to manifest, came so gradually that initially it went unnoticed. Martha first noticed small alterations in Michael's routine. He arrived earlier for his tasks, dedicated extra time to particularly fragile residents, occasionally volunteered for additional shifts when some staff member fell ill. His interactions, previously mechanical and distant, began to show flashes of genuine interest and compassion. The turning point occurred approximately 8 months after the start of his mandatory work, when a new resident arrived at the foundation. Edith, an 82-year-old lady with advanced Alzheimer's, had been literally abandoned at the institution's door by relatives who left only a brief note explaining they could no longer bear the costs of her care. In a state of profound confusion and distress, the elderly woman incessantly called for a son who never came to visit her. For reasons Martha couldn't completely understand, Michael felt particularly touched by this case. He began to dedicate extra hours exclusively to Edith, developing specific techniques to calm her during episodes of agitation, researching innovative treatments for her condition on his own, and frequently reading to her, even knowing she probably did not fully comprehend the words. It was during one of these reading sessions that Martha, discreetly observing from the doorway, heard words that made her maternal heart painfully contract. "You know, Edith, I abandoned my mother too." "I did much worse, actually," Michael confessed to the elderly woman who probably wasn't consciously registering his words. "Looking at you, I finally begin to understand what I caused. The emptiness, the betrayal, the pain that has no name." Michael's true transformation developed consistently from that moment. As if an internal barrier had been broken, he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his actions and their consequences. His work at the foundation ceased to be an externally imposed punishment and became a personal mission of reparation. He began to study geriatrics on his own, consulting volunteer specialists who visited the institution, absorbing practical and theoretical knowledge with an intensity that surprised even the most experienced professionals. He developed a special ability to connect with the most difficult cases: elderly people with severe dementia, those with histories of aggression due to abandonment trauma, or those who had simply given up on living after being left by their families. His own experience of nearly destroying the most sacred bond with his mother gave him a unique perspective that translated into seemingly inexhaustible patience. The elderly women, initially suspicious of the bitter-faced man who was clearly serving a sentence, gradually began to accept his presence, then seek his company, and finally treat him as a kind of collective substitute son. Something Martha observed with a mixture of admiration and a rarely admitted hint of maternal jealousy. "You're finding your way, Michael. Not what I would choose for you, but perhaps exactly what your soul needed," she commented one night, after observing him conduct with surprising skill a group therapy session for elderly women dealing with family abandonment. "These women are healing you as much as you help them." As the Foundation's reputation grew, attracting attention from authorities and the local press, Martha faced the challenge of protecting Michael's privacy while promoting the institutional work to ensure donations and community support. The original story, that Michael was fulfilling volunteer service as part of his life reorientation, was sufficiently vague to satisfy casual curiosity, but Martha knew that eventually the complete truth might emerge. Surprisingly, it was Michael himself who proposed a solution, approximately 1 year after the project began. "We cannot build this foundation on lies, even if they're well-intentioned," he stated during an administrative meeting, his voice carrying a maturity that Martha had never heard before. "I propose we establish a formal rehabilitation program for people who have committed crimes against family members, especially the elderly. I will be the first official participant, publicly assuming my story as an example of what genuine remorse and dedicated service can achieve." The proposal, initially received with skepticism by Martha and the small administrative team, eventually transformed into one of the Foundation's most innovative and recognized programs. Under appropriate judicial supervision, carefully selected individuals who had committed non-violent crimes against the elderly were given the opportunity to redirect their lives through structured community service, transforming my most terrible mistake into an opportunity for others to find redemption. "Perhaps that's the only way to give some meaning to what I did," Michael explained to the program's evaluation committee, his voice firm despite the obvious discomfort of publicly revisiting his story. "I've learned that true remorse isn't measured in words, but in consistent actions that seek to repair, even knowing that some wounds will never completely heal." The relationship between mother and son evolved slowly during these 2 years, moving from the initial, almost unbearable tension to a cautious coexistence, and finally to a mutual understanding that, if not exactly the unconditional love of before, carried its own depth and authenticity. Martha never managed to completely forget that terrible night, the moment when she saw in her son's eyes the clear intention to kill her. Michael, in turn, carried the constant weight of knowing that he had betrayed the purest love he had ever received, and that only his mother's extraordinary compassion had prevented him from spending the rest of his life behind bars. Paradoxically, this shared awareness of his moral fragility created a brutal honesty between them that they had never experienced before. There was no longer room for pretensions or manipulations. Each knew exactly what the other was capable of, both at their best and at their worst. Painful conversations that had been avoided for decades finally happened. About the absent father who'd abandoned them both, about Martha's sacrifices that Michael had never adequately valued, about the choices that gradually led him to the point of considering matricide as an acceptable solution to his financial difficulties. "I never imagined we would find a way back after that night," Martha confessed during one of those difficult conversations. "I still have nightmares sometimes, seeing your face when you realized you were poisoned with what you had prepared for me. And I frequently wake up hearing my own voice asking, 'What have you done?'" Michael responded, finally able to face the shame without looking away. The irony is that it was the right question, just directed at the wrong person. It was me who needed to confront what I had done. On this particular morning, 2 years after the incident that had nearly destroyed them both, the foundation was preparing for a special occasion. A local television station would send a crew to produce a report about the innovative work of Forgotten Hearts, especially highlighting the rehabilitation program that had attracted national attention. Martha adjusted the simple necklace she wore over the formal dress chosen for the interview, observing her reflection in the mirror with the serenity of someone who had finally found purpose after the storm. The last 2 years had left visible marks, more wrinkles around her eyes, completely white hair now, a greater dependence on the cane to move around. Internally, however, she felt stronger and more defined than at any other moment in her life. The personal tragedy had transformed into collective purpose, benefiting dozens of elderly women who, like her, had faced abandonment by their loved ones. The decision to use her fortune, the same one that had motivated Michael to plan her death, to create this refuge had proven deeply right. The money that had almost caused her destruction now built bridges of hope for women who had lost everything, including dignity. Through its innovative health programs, cultural activities, and especially genuine emotional support, the foundation had established a new paradigm for institutions dedicated to the elderly, frequently visited by specialists interested in replicating its model. "Who would have thought that at 72 I would become a kind of revolutionary in elderly care?" she commented to Nancy, who had remained her closest friend and now integrated the foundation's administrative board. "Life has mysterious ways of taking us exactly where we need to be." Activity at the foundation intensified with the imminent arrival of the reporting team. Staff adjusted the final details of the gardens. More autonomous residents chose their best clothes to possibly appear on television, and Michael discreetly supervised all preparations, making sure the environment was impeccable. Martha observed with quiet satisfaction her son interacting naturally with the elderly women, without any trace of the contempt or impatience that had characterized his initial interactions. Now he knew each one by name, remembered details of their personal stories, anticipated specific needs with a genuine attention that could not be faked. It had been a gradual but profound transformation, evidenced not only in grand gestures, but mainly in small daily attentions. The way he automatically adjusted the shawl of a lady with severe arthritis without her needing to ask, how he had memorized the food preferences of each resident, how he had developed games and activities adapted for different cognitive and physical levels. What had begun as punitive obligation had transformed into genuine vocation, something that not even Martha would have dared to hope for in the darkest moments after that fateful night. "Everyone is nervous about this interview, especially the ladies from the theatre group," Michael commented, approaching Martha after finalizing the external preparations. "I asked the reporter to be especially gentle with Marjorie. You know how anxious she gets with new situations." The reporting team arrived punctually, consisting of a young female reporter, a cameraman, and a production assistant. After the formal introductions, Martha led them on a tour of the facilities, explaining the philosophy behind each aspect of the foundation. She showed with special pride the therapeutic garden, the art studio, the library with a special section of large print books, and finally the most recent addition, a simplified recording studio where residents recorded their life stories as part of a collective memory project. Throughout, the camera captured scenes of harmonious coexistence among elderly women who had found in the foundation not only physical care, but a true substitute home where their dignity and individuality were respected. The reporter, visibly impressed with the welcoming environment, took constant notes while Martha explained how each element had been specifically designed to combat isolation and promote autonomy, even among residents with significant limitations. Abandonment in old age not only causes physical problems, but deep emotional wounds that need to be treated with the same seriousness, Martha explained to the camera. "Here, we seek to heal both body and spirit." "What inspired you to create such a special place, Ms. Martha?" asked the reporter, when they finally sat down for the formal interview in the central garden, "especially this innovative rehabilitation program that has attracted so much attention." It was the question Martha had anticipated and for which she had carefully prepared. Over the 2 years, She had developed a narrative that, without openly lying, protected the most intimate and painful details of the history between her and Michael. She spoke about her own experience of near abandonment, about the accident that had left her temporarily dependent, about how this vulnerability had made her deeply understand the situation of so many elderly women without family support. She mentioned the compensation received years earlier as an unexpected gift that needed to be used for a purpose greater than simple personal comfort. She explained the rehabilitation program as an opportunity to transform mistakes into learning and service, highlighting the rigorous selection criteria and continuous supervision. Michael remained discreetly at a distance during this part of the interview, occupying himself with administrative tasks while occasionally glancing in Martha's direction, a silent acknowledgement of the delicacy of the moment. "And how did your son become so deeply involved with this project?" continued the reporter, pointing to Michael, who was assisting a resident in her wheelchair. "He seems to have a special connection with the ladies." The question, although predictable, hit Martha at a still sensitive point. For a moment she relived that terrible night, the poison, the convulsions, the excruciating decision between justice and compassion. The world around her seemed to momentarily disappear, the voices and sounds of the garden replaced by the distant echo of the desperate screams from that night, the clinking of dropped glasses, the dull thud of Michael's body against the wooden floor. The fragrance of roses that now beautified the garden briefly yielded to the ghost of that metallic odor of poison, an olfactory memory so vivid she could almost feel it again. Her hands, now resting serenely on the floral fabric of her dress, remembered the violent tremor, while holding the syringe with the antidote. "Miss Martha, are you all right?" asked the reporter, leaning slightly forward. Noticing the sudden paleness in the interviewee's face, Martha blinked quickly, returning to the present. Butterflies danced among the garden flowers. A resident laughed in the background while playing dominoes. The water fountain murmured its constant song. She breathed deeply, feeling the scented air fill her lungs, anchoring her again in the reality she had meticulously built on the ashes of that tragedy. "Perfectly fine, dear. Some memories simply require a moment to be properly processed," she responded with a serene smile, reorganizing her thoughts. "The past has a peculiar way of reappearing when we least expect it." Maintaining external composure, Martha internally organized a response that would honor both the truth and the painful progress they had achieved. She delicately adjusted the brooch that fastened her shawl, a collective gift from the residents on the foundation's first anniversary, gaining precious seconds to calibrate her words. The afternoon sun filtered through the foliage, creating dancing golden patterns on the stone path, almost like a silent reminder that even the darkest shadows can eventually be permeated by light. "It's a profound question," she finally commented, looking directly at the camera, aware that her words would reach many other families in similar situations. There are stories that cannot be told in their entirety in front of cameras. Her eyes briefly met Michael's from a distance, who was now helping an elderly lady walk through the garden, holding her arm with a gentleness that dramatically contrasted with the violence of his past intentions. That simple eye contact contained an entire world of shared history: pain, betrayal, regret, forgiveness, rebuilding. A silent language developed through tears and confrontations, through nighttime confessions and daily forgiveness, through small gestures of trust being slowly rebuilt like a patiently restored mosaic. "Michael and I," she continued, turning to the reporter, "had to relearn how to be mother and son, not in the conventional way, but through a much harder and, paradoxically, much truer path." The gentle breeze stirred Martha's silver hair, while a blue butterfly momentarily landed on the arm of her chair, as if it too wanted to hear that story of unlikely metamorphosis. With a calm but firm voice, Martha offered the answer she knew was not only appropriate for the moment, but deeply true in its essence. "My son didn't take care of me, but now he takes care of many mothers who have been forgotten," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience in every word, her eyes shining with contained tears that she refused to shed in front of the cameras. Maternal love teaches even in the most painful circumstances. Sometimes we need to lose something to truly understand its value. Michael found his purpose helping these women regain their dignity, and in the process, Her voice faltered slightly, the only external sign of the emotion consuming her internally. He recovered the humanity he had almost completely lost. Did you like Martha and Michael's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.